Coming back to the message, I don't know if you remember what I preached on. It was a little over a month ago already, my last message. But I had preached on the Word of God. And so this morning I feel like maybe it's an extension or a continuation of that message. But I titled it, "The Word of God Shall Stand Forever." Taken from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 7 and 8. "The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, because the Spirit of the Lord bloweth upon it. Surely the people is grass. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever." God's word shall stand forever. Recently I've been reading through the Old Testament, and I have been impressed with the history that is there. So much that we can learn, even in being in the New Covenant, so much that we can learn from the history in the Old Testament. And so this morning I'd actually like to share two stories with you, if we have time. I think we do. Two stories from the Old Testament that I read through in the recent months that just impressed me with some of the facts that stand out there, how God's word does not change. So the first story takes place shortly after Gideon had defeated the Midianites and the Amalekite armies of approximately 135,000 people with his little army of 300 men, God being the chief commander there. So Gideon and his army had defeated these people, and afterward the people gathered together and asked Gideon to be their leader. They were like, "Wow, this is great. You be our leader." And he responded, "I will not rule over you. Neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Well, Gideon, he had many wives, and he had 70 sons. And he also had a concubine who lived in Shechem, and she bore him a son and named him Abimelech. So after Gideon dies at a ripe old age, Abimelech goes to the people of Shechem, and I hope you can follow with me. I find it difficult sometimes to follow these stories, and the names and the places get confusing to me. If it would say, a group from Shipshawana went over to Goshen, then I could understand it pretty easily, but I get lost sometimes. But so here, Abimelech, he goes to his own people in Shechem, and he says, "Is it better for 70 of us brothers to rule over you, or maybe just one of us?" And by the way, remember, I'm from your blood, I'm from your town. So the people of Shechem, they talk together and they say, "Just one. We'll take one. We'll take you. Be our leader." And remember, Gideon had said, "My son shall not rule over you." We want God for your ruler. So they take 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal, and they give it to Abimelech and say, "Be our leader." He takes that money and he goes and hires some wicked people to help him. And they head out to Gideon's house where all his 70 brothers were, and they kill every one of his brothers except for the youngest one, whose name was Jotham. Jotham caught wind of this and he ran for his life. But Abimelech kills all the rest. And then they gather together, and the people of Shechem gather together, and they're going to anoint him king. They want him for their leader. And so as they're all gathered together, having this crowning of the king, Jotham, the youngest son, poor man, he should have been scared for his life, but I think he had a connection with God. We don't read much about him, but he must have had a connection with God. And he takes courage and he goes up on a mountain and faces these people, the very people that were wanting to kill him. And he preaches a real short little message, an impressive little message to these people that were wanting to kill him. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. We'll leave that for right now. But he preaches the message and then he runs for his life. Well, God allowed Abimelech to rule Shechem for 3 years. But then all at once the picture starts to change. The men of Shechem turn against him. There were robberies, there were riots. They started following after another man, and they cursed Abimelech. Abimelech gathers his soldiers together and sets off to destroy whoever crosses his path, just brutally destroying the people of Shechem. The next day, when the men of Shechem went out into he encountered a city and destroyed them. The next day, the people of Shechem, I guess they thought they were safe or something, and they got up and went out into the field, and he ambushes them. He kills all the people in the field. He goes into the city and slaughters the city, beats down the city and spreads salt on it. He goes to the tower of Shechem, quickly lights that on fire, and destroys about 1,000 men and women that were in the tower by lighting it on fire. And from there, he goes to Thebez and takes that city, except for a strong tower where the people that could fled to that tower. And Abimelech, he's out of his mind, and he's out to destroy anyone who crosses his path. He storms the tower and plans to quickly set it on fire as he did the tower of Shechem. And so I'm reading this, and I'm like, okay, what is going on? I said, what? I thought these people of Shechem were his friends. I thought they paid him to be their ruler. And he is destroying. What is going on? And so I go back, and I'm reading this again. I'm like, what is going on here? And maybe you would have caught it the first time, but sometimes I have to read, a lot of times I have to read stuff twice to get the full picture. So I go back again. I'm like, what is happening here? And if you care to, you can read the story in Judges 9. But going back to the little message that Jotham preached to them that day, when they were anointing Abimelech king, it's a pretty neat little message. I don't think we'll take time to read it. But basically what he is saying is, should a man leave the noble work that God has called him to do in an effort to gain prestige and power? He brings in, like the trees of the field came to the olive tree and said, won't you be Lord over us? But he says, should a man leave the noble work that God has called him to do to try to gain power and prestige? And then in verse 15 of Judges 9, he refers to Abimelech as a bramble. And he says, I'm going to read that in verse 15. And the bramble said unto the trees, if in truth ye anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. How much shadow do you get from a bramble? Well, that was a pretty good description of Abimelech. Put your trust in my shadow. And if not, and this was Jotham speaking in regards to Abimelech, and if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. So here he had already started a prophecy. If you don't enjoy it, if you don't enjoy my protection, fire will come out of the bramble and destroy the cedars of Lebanon. And then in verse 19 and 20, Jotham still speaking, if ye have dealt truly and sincerely with Jerubbaal, which is actually another name for Gideon. So if ye have dealt truly and sincerely with Gideon and with his house this day, then rejoice ye in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and the house of Millo. And let fire come out from the men of Shechem and from the house of Millo and devour Abimelech. This fire can be taken literally or figuratively. Here we see how Abimelech had turned against his own people and had literally destroyed them with fire, some of them, and others he had killed with the sword. And now coming back to the story, so the men were, or the people had fled to the tower of Thebez, and Abimelech is gathering wood. He's going to light that thing on fire, just like he did the tower of Shechem. And as he runs up to the tower, quick, let's get this thing lit. God inspires a woman on the top of the tower to take the threshing stone. So the way I understand it, they would have in a threshing stone, maybe they would have it in their house to grind the wheat, but there would be kind of like a trough with a little bit of a cup shape in it, and then they would have a big stone or kind of like a ball, and they would roll that in there to grind the wheat. And this lady took that big stone and she chucks it out over the wall and hits Abimelech's skull and crushes it. And Abimelech quickly turns to his armor bearer and says, "Quick, kill me, because I don't want them to be able to say that a woman killed Abimelech." And I thought, how foolish. What is he going to care after he dies? What people say who killed him? But nevertheless, the fire, in a figurative sense, of the people of Shechem turned around and killed him. The people of Shechem, the woman and his armor bearer, killed him, destroyed him. And it was all part of the prophecy of Jotham. God's word will stand forever. I believe Jotham was inspired by God to speak those words. And although Abimelech experienced 3 years of what he thought he wanted, God's word was not going to fall short, and it was going to come to pass. God was not going to let his wickedness go unpunished for killing his 70 brothers, or 69, or whatever it was. Some things that stood out to me as I read this passage. We had been discussing ordination, and I read this passage. One thing that stood out to me is Jotham was the youngest son. You know, we don't read that he had any special calling, any special talent. It appears that he had a respect for God and had a connection with him by some of the things he said in his little message. What we do know is that he received a word from God, and he faithfully proclaimed it. Even though it was dangerous, he risked his life to proclaim that message to his enemies. But God honored his word, and it came to pass exactly as he said. It was probably one of the shortest and yet most powerful messages ever preached. What God needs for leadership is not someone with great talent, position, or even experience. What he does need is someone who is in touch with him and can hear his word, someone who is not afraid to boldly proclaim, even in the face of great danger. You know, the woman that threw that millstone, I don't expect that she had done a lot of practice. I don't think she was that excellent a thrower. It really didn't matter how bad a shot she was. When God inspired her to throw, it didn't matter what her talent was or how far away Abimelech was. All God needed was someone to obey and to throw. And God would take care of the details. God is the one who makes it happen. God's word shall stand. When we proclaim God's word, he takes care of the details. He's the one who makes it happen. If I stand up here this morning and proclaim my words, then I better be an expert, and it still won't happen. But if we proclaim God's word, then it's in his lap, and he will take care of it. And the other thing that stood out to me is God will punish evil men for their wickedness, even if they may seem to prosper for a while. You know, sometimes we're like, God, how can this go on? How can this go on? You know, the war. Why, God? So many innocent people losing their lives. But judgment will come someday. The other story I like to look at is when Saul was king in 1 Samuel 13. I would say at this point Israel had a lukewarm relationship with God. Saul had already lost favor with God because he had disobeyed. He had offered sacrifices and instead of waiting on Samuel. The Philistines had oppressed him because of their rejection of God. And yet, they still knew they needed God. They still recognized it, but I'd say it was a very lukewarm relationship. Things weren't going very well. The Philistines had come against them. Saul had mustered his soldiers together, and he had a grand total of 3,000 soldiers. And according to, and this might depend on which translation you read, but according to the King James Version, the Philistines had 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the sea. And that's what they were facing. And on top of it all, Saul and his army only had 2 weapons. Only him and his son Jonathan carried a spear. There were no other weapons in Israel because the Philistines had taken them. They had to go to the Philistines to even sharpen their knives or their plowshares because the Philistines had taken care of that. 2 swords and an army of 3,000 men. Well, they were scared. I don't think I can blame them. They were scared. The Philistines were infesting the land and coming out against them with their horses and chariots. And the Israelites turned and they run off into hiding. They run into the mountains and behind the rocks, and they're hiding. They're scared. They don't know what's going to happen. So one day, Jonathan decides that he is going to go attack the Philistines. Just him and his armor bearer. Jonathan recognized that the battle was not about personal preference. You know, it wasn't just these people that I don't like over here. He said, these uncircumcised fellows. In the Old Testament, that would refer to evil people. The people outside of God's plan. He was like, let's go deal with these people. They're a disgrace to the kingdom of God. And the armor bearer said, sure, let's go. So Jonathan and him take off. And Jonathan says, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or few. Beautiful. The faith that Jonathan had. 1 sword and 1 man against maybe a couple 100,000. But he said, it's nothing. God can save by many or few. And yet he acknowledges, he recognizes his need for having God's direction. And so he kind of puts the fleece out, you might say, to make sure that this is what God wanted him to do. And God gave him the go-ahead. And so they climb up the rocks and they approach the Philistines. God steps in and puts a panic in the heart of the Philistines. Now, I don't know if God shook the earth or if it was the result of the panic of the Philistines. But it says the earth shook, and the Philistines just panicked. And the other Israelites saw that the armies were melting. So Saul and his 598 men, or whatever it was, suddenly they saw the Philistine armies just melting. And they said, what's going on? And so they quickly started counting men, and they're like, oh, Jonathan is gone. God was working. And so then Saul got courage and his men, and they took off and started running after him. And I find this almost a bit comical too, because what were they going to do? How were they going to fight the Philistines if they didn't have any swords or spears? Maybe they had billy clubs. I don't know what they had, but they took off. They saw something was happening, and they started chasing the Philistines. And I don't know, but I wonder maybe the Philistines didn't even drop their swords as they ran. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But somehow, I am assuming some of that happened, or maybe the people that were killed, they grabbed their swords and they pursued the Philistines and had a great victory. As they were going through the woods, they found some honey on the ground. And Jonathan reached down with his staff and he dips the honey and he puts it to his mouth. He was tired, he was hungry, and he puts it to his mouth, and it says his eyes were enlightened. It energized him. It was like, woo, feels good. And one of his soldiers says, no, he says, you shouldn't do that. Saul has bound us with an oath, saying that we may not eat until tonight. Saul was so intent on pursuing his enemies, he made a foolish decision. What was he thinking? But he said he had made this under oath that no one was allowed to eat until evening. Well, they continued to pursue the enemy. And when evening came, they took of the sheep, the oxen, the spoil of the Philistines, and they slaughtered them. And then you get the picture, the people were almost crazy. And they just slaughtered them and ate, and were strengthened again. And Saul says, let's not stop here. Let's go down and attack them by night. Let's surprise them and utterly destroy them. And the army said, sure, let's go. But the priest that was with them says, wait a minute. I think we should ask the Lord, see what he wants us to do. And so Saul calls out to God and says, God, what do you want us to do? Shall we pursue the enemy? And God was silent. God wouldn't answer. And so Saul recognizes this as something is wrong. There must be sin in the camp. And so they take lots. The lot points to Jonathan. And Saul says, what did you do? Jonathan said, all I did was eat a little bit of honey. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. Saul says, you must die. And may God do ever so severely with me if I don't kill you. A man who had made a foolish command, now he makes another foolish command. But the people step up. The people step up and they say, no, this won't happen today. God miraculously used Jonathan to save our lives and gave this great deliverance. Why should we have such a death like this tonight? And the people delivered him, spared his life. And they never went to pursue the Philistines again. That's where the story stops. That was the end of it. Or at least of that story. So some things that stood out to me in this story. Once again, God is not limited to talent, to size, or resources. That's not an issue to God. But just like Jonathan wanted to be sure that he was in God's will, that's where we need to be. If we know that we are in God's will, then we have no reason to be scared. God doesn't look at our resources. He only looks at our availability. You know, I think we limit God by our lack of faith. What kind of faith did Jonathan have to go tackle those Philistines with just the two of them? Oh, the miracles we might see if we only had faith in God. Enough faith that would take us out of our caves, out of our hiding spots, and would take us out to face the enemy. What we could do with one sword against 100,000. You know, God doesn't need us to have swords. All he needs is us to have faith. Secondly, You know, Saul, I don't think he had a very close relationship with God. He had disobeyed God. He recognized that that they needed God, but I think he had drifted away from God. I don't think he had a very close relationship. And here we see him making I'm going to say a stupid decision. Very foolish. When he, under oath, told his people that they dare not eat until evening. Here was a ruler that had lost his connection with God. Now he makes a stupid call. Jonathan even said, "Why did my father say that? You soldiers could eat of the honey and be refreshed, and how great would be the slaughter if you would only be allowed to eat." But from what I understand from reading this story, God honored that decision of that king. Even though he had already lost his position with God, he lost his relationship with God, even though he had made a foolish decree, I believe that God honored that decree. And the reason I believe that is the simple fact that when they experienced this great victory, but when they were going to continue to pursue the enemy, and they called out to God, God didn't answer. It reminds me a lot of the story when Achan sinned. They had a tremendous victory, but Achan took of the forbidden things and hid it in his tent. Joshua was confident. This was a wonderful deliverance, and so he says, "Let's go take Ai." And he doesn't ask God, just like Saul. He forgets to ask God. He feels good. He's confident. He says, "Let's go take Ai." And then they were defeated. Why? Because there was sin in the camp. I really believe that if Joshua would have stopped and asked God, "Should we go?" I believe that God would have showed him that there is sin in the camp. You better not go. But Joshua forgot to ask. In this story, Saul forgot to ask. But fortunately for them, the priest was with them. And the priest remembered that they need God's blessing. And maybe I'm reading too much in here, but I believe that God honored that decree. Because God did not answer when Saul called, even after such a great deliverance. What I see in there is that God's word stands. And if God puts someone into position, he honors that position, even when people walk away from God. Even when people do foolish things, God still honors their authority. Not because of how good the person is, but because of their calling. It challenges me. What is my respect for the authority that God has placed over me? You know, we can find plenty of reasons to say why, it doesn't even make any sense what they are asking. It's foolishness. But is that reason enough to disrespect the authority that God has put in my life? I'm troubled by the lack of respect I see around us. Not so much what I see in the world, because I expect that from the world. But even in our own churches, it seems as time goes on, there is less and less respect for authority. You know, I see fathers and mothers who have lost respect for the policemen. They've lost respect for their church leaders. But they don't understand why their children don't respect them. What goes around comes around. And when God places authority in our lives, He expects us to honor them, to respect them, regardless if they are right, regardless if they make a wise choice or not. Another thing that stood out to me in this story. So Saul decreed that Jonathan should be killed. But we see the people coming forward and rescuing him. We don't see anywhere that God, and it might sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I don't think I am. We don't see anywhere that God says, well, no, Jonathan should have been killed. There was an oath to me. I think God honored Saul's decree, but when the men were unified and they came and approached Saul, I think they did it in a respectful way. It doesn't say they grabbed their swords to kill him because of the decree he had made. But they said, no, this is wrong. This is a day that God has used him and has delivered us. Should we have death in our midst today? And together they were unified. I feel God honored that as well. When the people were unified, even when they disagreed with Saul, I believe God honored that. So I believe there is a time when leaders are in the wrong, when they go away from God, when we can base it on godly principles and the group is unified to come together and to say, no, we can't go here. This is wrong. I believe God can honor that as well. Those were some things that stood out to me and really impacted me as I read those stories. God's word will stand forever. Just have a few verses here I'd like to read to emphasize the fact that God's word will stand. Practical applications. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Hebrews 11:16. We saw faith in both of these accounts. If these men would not have had faith, they would not have had God's blessing either. In order to please God, we need to believe that he is greater than our problems and that he has everything that we need. God will reward those who do not diligently seek him, but it will be in a different way. It may appear like they're getting along just fine, but God will settle the score someday. Philippians 4:19, but my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches in glory. You know, I don't know what for battles you are facing. I don't know what the enemy looks like to you. But God's word will stand forever. And he says that he will supply all your needs. Can I claim that for a promise? Can I look past my emotions, my feelings, my discouragement, and embrace the fact that God will supply all my needs? Not just almost, just barely, but according to his riches and glory. Now, how rich is that? Wow. That's how God will supply my needs. 1 Peter 2:17, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. It's a command from God's word that will stand. God expects that from us today as much as he did back in Saul's day or in Peter's day when he wrote that. Here are three more. I'd like to just to kind of wrap up the message. They're not really related. Maybe the first one is to the stories But I think it's timeless truths that I want to take this opportunity to remind us of. And we could have 5 more messages on timeless truths that from God's word that will not change. But here are 3 more. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. It's a promise from God. And in John 3:3, Jesus gave us a promise. Except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. This will not change as long as time is. It's the word of God. Unless a man and a woman become born again, they will not experience the kingdom of God in this life or in heaven. There's plenty of people today who will try to tell you that they can get to heaven because of the good they have done, or because of this, or because of that. But Jesus said, unless we're born again, we will not be there. And one more in John 6:37, Jesus said, a beautiful promise, he that cometh to me, I will in no wise cast out. Isn't that precious? Regardless of where you come from, regardless of what you've done, regardless of your talents, your gifts, if we come to Jesus, he won't cast us out. What a blessing. And it will, a promise that will stand forever. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, we pause before you. We thank you for your word that stands forever. We thank you for these stories in the Old Testament that speak to us about your power, about your word, and how you will bring judgment, how you will protect those who follow you. Father, we just pray that you would draw us into a closer relationship with you. Help us to believe your word. Help us to have faith, to fight the battles that we face. Help us to look to you for our strength to overcome. I ask, Father, that you would take these words and you would bless them however you see best, however would best enhance your kingdom for your honor and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.